It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I'm going to stay down here so that she can come up and get set up. Our next speaker is Florence Williams. The title of her discussion is The Power of Awe. Florence is a journalist and the author of a new book, The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. She is a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, the New York Review of Books, Slate, Mother Jones, High Country News, the Oprah Magazine, W, Bicycling, and numerous other publications. And I was running out of breath. She's also the writer and host of the new Audible original series, Breasts Unbound. She's a fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature and a visiting scholar at George Washington University. Her work focuses on the environment, health, and science. So please join me in welcoming Florence Williams for her presentation.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I usually work in a little office by myself, and to get out and actually see so many people who are often in the field and leaders in this work of getting people outside, it's just a great honor to be here. So thank you for having me. 10 minutes, not a lot of time, so I'm going to move through quickly. I wrote this book, The Nature Fix, about how and why being in green spaces makes us feel good. I was inspired, as I am through much of my science writing, by my own personal experience. And what happened to me was that I spent 2 decades living in the Rocky Mountain West, 10 years in Montana, 12 years in Colorado. I recreated often in public lands, and in fact, I was an artist in residence on the Lewis and Clark Forest, and it was a great moment of creativity for me at that time. So I'm so glad that program's expanding. So I went from having a backyard that looked like this to having one that looked like this. Now, this is the C&O Canal. I'm actually a huge fan, but the access to it is really difficult from where I live in the Palisades. I have to scramble across a freeway and over a chain-linked fence and down a bridge embankment with lots of graffiti, airplanes overhead. It was a big change for me. And I just noticed that my mental state noticed it also. So I was more anxious living in this new urban environment of DC. I moved here about 5 years ago. And I started to wonder more about this idea that journalist Richard Louv puts out about nature deficit disorder. Is that what I was experiencing? Was I having a withdrawal from my deep attachment to the public lands of the Rockies? And what did the science have to say about that? So it launched me into an investigation where I received a couple of magazine assignments from Outside Magazine and from National Geographic. Those enabled me to really go around the world and see what the science was saying about how we feel in nature, how our bodies respond, what our brains and what our physiology is doing. I often do this sort of first-person participatory journalism. So here I am, I'm actually having my cortisol, stress hormones measured in different environments. In the bottom, I'm wearing a portable EEG cap, which measures brain wave states. And I'm having my heart rate variability tested also. That was in a forest in South Korea. But I started out in Japan, where there's this sort of eccentric practice of forest bathing. And this is actually something that's being promulgated by the Japanese Forest Agency as a program to encourage people to get outside, especially stressed out Tokyoites who have the longest work hours really in the history of the world. And sometimes they literally do actually drop dead at their desks. There's a word for this, karoshi. And so they're being encouraged to go outside. Forest bathing involves really opening up all of your senses. So it's sort of a shortcut to feeling restored and relaxed. So a way of, and there are, by the way, forest rangers who are trained specifically in this, of facilitating people hearing the birdsong, drinking tea made from vegetation in the forest, breathing in these wonderful redolent odors of the cypress forest, which are so common there. And the scientists are recording what goes on after just 15 minutes. They've had over 600 subjects come through, and they've seen this drop in blood pressure, drop in heart rate, and a substantial decrease in cortisol. This is a forest in South Korea. It's really taken its cue from the Japanese research. I walked into this, what's called a healing forest, and there are actually about a dozen designated healing forests, 500 healing rangers. This is not what I typically see a group of men doing in the woods. In Montana, I might see some fishing poles and some guns and some Jim Beam. This is actually a group of firefighters with PTSD. And they are on a 3-day retreat, and they're doing partner yoga. And they were also making floral collages, having tea ceremonies. These are big macho guys. And I said, how do you like this? And they said to me, oh, we wish we could live here. So fantastic. This is another program in South Korea. This is for adolescents with digital addiction. So it's a digital detox program. Digital addiction is a big concern in many parts of Asia. In this picture with the women, these are actually the mothers of the adolescents. Because if you have a digitally addicted teenager, chances are you need a little bit of stress recovery as well. And they're doing some sort of leaf art. And then in the other picture, the forest ranger is actually taking a boy across what looks like and is a fairly steep cliff, and it's dropping down into a river. And she said, look, if we are going to compete with video games, we have to provide a lot of risk. We have to provide excitement. And that's how these kids are going to get engaged. It's how they're going to use all of their senses, which they haven't engaged in a long time. And it's what these kids need in order to know that there are other options out there for having fun. I visited a number of forest kindergartens. I am very passionate about getting children outside, as I know many of you are in this room. There's a lot I could say about this. The picture of the girl on the tree limb, I'll just talk about that for a minute. I love this picture because she's probably 5 or 6 years old. She's wearing her pajamas to kindergarten, because why not? And I love it that there's this other little girl watching her and saying, someday I'm going to do that too. And what so much time in the woods enables these little kids to do is really develop their self-confidence, develop their self-esteem, their sense of adventure. We know that these are especially important for girls. It's another reason I like this photo. Recent survey by REI, which is now in the middle of their sort of Force of Nature, Get Women and Girls Outside campaign, shows that when girls spend more time outside, they develop these skills of leadership and self-confidence that actually extend all the way into their adulthood. And interestingly, a lot of the girls who were surveyed first went outside because their mothers took them there. So if we can get girls outside, we can get them to grow up and take their girls outside, hopefully we don't sort of break the cycle of disconnection from nature that we're now seeing. This is a program in Denmark, and every time I look at this hammock, I want to dive into it. I'm sure some of you do as well. It's a 12-week program for severely mentally depressed patients. These are patients who are too depressed to work. And it's been such a successful program that Denmark and Sweden are now actually funding these programs. They are seeing better outcomes in terms of people returning to work than any other interventions they're doing. The idea here is that the patients are really able to sort of take their time reconnecting with the natural world, and again, engaging sort of their full sensory and perceptual systems, which may be sort of shut down in depression. And over 12 weeks, they start to really not only engage with the nature, but also with each other. And they start actually growing the plants and cultivating. So we know that living near green space from large-scale epidemiological studies has some pretty profound health effects. Here they are. I'm not going to read them all, but we see a lower incidence of 15 stress-related diseases in people who live closest to green space. That's from Europe. Most of these studies are from Europe. Lower mortality rates, better birth outcomes. But the bottom study is a new study out of Harvard, and it shows that people who live closest to green space, 13% drop in depression, and a 13% drop in overall mortality. They're also seeing some pretty interesting drops in cancer. And that's based on 120,000 nurses. So they're going to be drilling down a little bit deeper to find out, well, what are they doing in that green space? Does living close to it mean you're actually using it? Or is it just looking at all that green? Or is it something about the air pollution? They're trying to figure it out, and they don't really know. One of the mechanisms that I'm really interested in that is not talked about very often is this idea of awe. And there's actually really recent research in the last 10 years about the science of awe and what it does to us when we experience it. It's considered a positive emotion. This is sort of a technical definition. Awe is an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli that transcend current frames of reference. So another way of saying that is it basically blows your mind. And I think we've all experienced that phenomenon. Some of the awe studies are very interesting. They'll put people in a lab. Psychologists will put people in a lab. They'll show them slides of beautiful nature compared to slides of, maybe a suburb or an urban setting. And the subjects who look at the beautiful nature score much higher on classifications such as intrinsic self-worth. They'll identify themselves as feeling that their families matter, their relationships matter, and lower on external measures like fame or money. And that's just based on 5 minutes of looking at beautiful pictures. This is one of my favorite studies. It's a quick study out of the University of California, Berkeley. This is Paul Piff and Associates. And they sent groups of students on campus at Berkeley to gaze up at a tall grove of eucalyptus trees for 1 minute. And they sent another group to gaze at a tall building on campus. And in each scenario, a researcher accidentally dropped a box of pens and then kind of quietly counted how many pens each student picked up. And it turns out the students who were looking at the trees picked up statistically more pens than the ones who were looking at the building, which validated the hypothesis that when we experience awe, it makes us more generous and more pro-social. When we experience awe, we tend to feel small, looking at the universe, looking at the Milky Way. It takes us outside of our own personal problems, makes us feel connected to something larger, and makes us feel more connected to each other. And we know that awe, for example, wants to be shared. And that may be one of the reasons it makes us feel sort of more community-minded. This is a Girl Scout troop. And I love it, too, because the girls are pointing something out in the creek. And we know that awe also fosters curiosity. So researchers want to know what's actually happening in the brain. Are there biomarkers you can see when our brains change in nature? This is a researcher at the University of Utah, David Strayer. He's really interested in what happens in wilderness. If we know that 1 minute of looking at awe can make you feel good, what happens after 3 days? And in fact, he's found a 47% improvement in creativity in backpackers after 3 days out in the wild. He's also looking at specific brain waves in the frontal cortex of the brain, and the theory there is that when we're in our normal, everyday, modern lives, our frontal cortex is overworking. We're answering emails, we're always responding to stimuli fast coming at us. And when we're out in nature, the stimuli comes at a slower pace. It's generally the pace of walking, or maybe it's the pace of a mountain bike. And our frontal cortex is allowed to relax. But then I'm not going to talk about this study, but it said the same thing, so I don't have time. And so the idea is that when we're in wilderness, where is that activation going? If the activation is not in the frontal part of our brain, what parts of the brain is it going to? We don't know. But the theories are that when we're out in wilderness, other parts of our brain sort of wake up. And those are the parts of our brain that are associated perhaps with empathy or with creativity or long-range planning, self-concept. We know we go to the wilderness sometimes when we need to recover from stress, when we need to recover from grief. There have been many, many accounts of that in the public literature and the popular literature, and now we're starting to see it in science as well. Of course, most of us live in cities, so we need to figure out how to create awe in cities. This is in Singapore. Cool programs there and policies to encourage builders to put gardens everywhere. Click, 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 click. Click, click, click. It is a nice picture. Okay, there we go. This is the city of Wellington, New Zealand. Downtown Wellington, there's actually a snorkel trail, and it's signed, so people can experience awe right there. Oops. This is Brookside Gardens right here in Maryland. And I'd like to just end with this nature pyramid concept. The idea being that the wilderness is sort of the rare, special kind of dessert dose that we don't get very often, but we still sometimes can enjoy and use. In the middle is this kind of deliberate immersion in natural areas and parks. And at the bottom is kind of this everyday nature that we really need in our cities. And all of you in this room, I know, work at all of those 3 tiers. And I am so grateful and thank you so much for your work. So thanks.